All right, everyone. I think we are live. So good morning and good afternoon to everybody again. Hello to everyone at Berklee Valencia. And thank you to all of the students organizing. I know that there's been a ton of work that's gone into this event. This is my second and a half panel this morning already. I'm in Boston. And I know that the students working behind the scenes have put a ton of work taking 2 to 3 events that usually happen live on the Berklee Valencia campus and bringing them all to the digital space. As somebody who's planned many events, I can imagine that that was a huge labor. So congrats, it seems like things are going really smoothly. So for those that weren't on my last panel, my name is Nicole. I am Managing Director of Berklee's Institute for Creative Entrepreneurship, and I also am currently leading the helm at Open Music Initiative, and that is how I got to meet Deborah and Michael. And so today I'm hoping we can have a discussion around sort of what Open Music Initiative is, and we turned 4 just a few weeks ago on June 13th. And so it's been an interesting 4 years. I think the industry is in some different places than it was 4 years ago. And Michael and Deborah are 2 of the people who have been there since the beginning. So before we fully jump in, why don't we do some introductions? So joining us this morning, we have Deborah Newman. She is founder of MusicStrat and was also, has had a long career in the music industry, including VP of Programming and Sales for Sony Music Video Enterprises and VP of Industry Relations and Licensing for Muse. And so has been very involved on the metadata side and what I like to think of as the liner notes. And I learned a little bit, Deborah, about your time also in an actual record store. And I feel like it's a really good analog of like being in charge of metadata and having been, you know, a record store worker and like sort of being like the actual metadata human fountain. So welcome.
Thank you.
And then we have Michael Lau, who is a Berklee alumni himself. And he is also COO and CTO of Round Hill Music, as well as a mechanical licensing collective operations committee member. And that's maybe about a year or so that you've been in that role. And you graduated Berklee a few years ago. And I think that, you know, when we are on the Boston campus, you come by every once in a while, and it's nice to have you connect with students. So thank you both for joining. I'm sorry that we aren't able to have Mark Isherwood of DDEX. He had something come up unexpectedly and was in touch this morning. So I'm sorry that we're missing him, but I think we'll have a great discussion. So can you both talk a little bit, before we dig into open music, can you talk a little bit about your work in the music industry, sort of your roles, because I think one of the things that's really interesting, and we'll talk about this later, is Open Music Initiative spans the entire music value chain, and it goes from sort of point of creation, and we have a ton of artists involved. We have a lot of people that are working at that point of creation, and it extends all the way to the point of consumption and back to reporting and payments and sort of everything in between. We have health companies, we have VR companies, we have a lot of companies that are a bit tangentially involved, but certainly part of this ecosystem. So can you talk a little bit more about your respective work within that supply chain? And Deborah, you want to start things off?
Okay, starting from the present as opposed to the past.
Yeah.
I currently work as a consultant. I'm an independent consultant, and my background is very diverse in the music business, so I kind of spread out into a lot of different areas. I have some experience in the metadata space. I think, as Nicole mentioned, I worked for a company called Muse for a while, and I learned everything I ever wanted to know about data and metadata in those days, because I was definitely not a data person. I was usually on the creative side. I after being in the music business for many, many years and working for CBS Records, which became Sony Music for 20 years, and then working in the digital online world, I decided to go to law school. So I, as a grown-up, applied and got in, amazingly enough, and not that long ago went to law school here in New York, mostly because I wanted to study copyright on a deeper level than I had actually ever learned copyright and digital media. They don't really teach the business side of in law school. They teach the law side, and I became a lawyer, and I very interested in all the rights issues around music and digital music, and I follow that very deeply. But my background was always on the creative side. I worked with a lot of artists over the years. I made music videos when music videos were the new thing. I got into digital when digital was the new thing, when people had modems that were 14.4, very, very slow, and it took 45 minutes to download a song. So, I think I have a pretty broad perspective of the industry from a lot of different points of view, and I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, Deborah. And Michael, how about you? What has your trajectory been post Berklee?
Many, many years, as you said. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, everything that I've, the path that my experience has taken me from when I graduated in '90. Yes, I will admit that. I made sure I shaved this morning, so the gray beard was gone. So I'd look a lot younger.
No quarantine beard?
No quarantine beard, at least for this. That I started early on as selling music library, and then that sort of got into supervising music for sports and so on, and that actually got me into music supervising for the '94 Winter Olympics from Lillehammer, Norway. Wow. And back then there was no iTunes, there was no anything. And I needed to manage, 200 plus hours of music. And besides putting together a edited library of CDs, that's a whole nother story. I needed to learn database programming because I had, 50 to 75 producers and assistant directors and all those, other people needed to pull music, very quickly. So I learned database programming, and then that led to, well, how do we categorize the music? So we started sitting down, me on my commute and during the day, just basically like, okay, this music is introspective, this is triumphant, this is all this other stuff. What's the mood? What's the genre? What's the beats per minute? What's all this stuff? And that was sort of like my intro, in the early '90s into metadata. And that is sort of, and then subsequently, once that music was broadcast and found via that system, it needed to be provided to the PROs in the US, BMI, ASCAP, and CSAC on a cue sheet. So that is also providing metadata, the proper composer metadata, the proper title, all the length, and so on and so forth. And then that actually sort of, that was sort of like my jump start back in, I guess, 92, 93 into metadata. And throughout my, almost 30-year career, that has always been sort of like a backdrop of what I've been doing. I've created music publishing creative systems where smaller indie publishers that have licensed. When I was at Warner Chappell, they actually licensed it for me as well. When I was at Warner Chappell for almost 8 years, pushed that agenda, which ultimately led to me creating the creative pitching system that they've been using for the last, 10 years. And then when I left Warner Chappell, still working in the sort of the metadata space, sort of like behind the scene, not sort of like a forefront kind of a thing. And then getting to Roundhill, when we started Roundhill, the end of 2010 into 2011, we were buying old iconic catalogs where you wouldn't necessarily, when you buy a catalog, you wouldn't necessarily get all the information. So we had to do a metadata scrub. And then that sort of led to, us growing and be able to create a database and then be able to take that metadata and sending it out to other publishers, other to networks, to wherever else, to be able to properly monetize our music and get credit for that. And then, being introduced in, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago to OMI, and that sort of like secondary passion of mine came to the forefront, and here I am today.
Yeah. So you both speak quite a bit about metadata, and it was a word I didn't think about very much before coming to Berklee myself. And I see a question here. So let me talk a little bit about open music, and then we'll jump back to the conversation. So as we mentioned, open music was founded about 4 years ago, and it was founded to create this system of protocols, open protocols for interoperability, especially pertaining to rights holder information and attribution within the music supply chain, and to allow that data to flow effortlessly, efficiently, accurately. I am sad that Mark is not here. Mark is with the Digital Data Exchange, and him and his team have done a tremendous amount of work over many years prior to open music and throughout, in creating standards on how that data is transmitted. And if you ever have the opportunity, I'm going to tell everybody on here to check out what they refer to as their subway map. I find it really interesting as far as how they think about, again, I think it's actually a great map of the music value chain, and you see all of the different ways that all of the different constituents need to speak to each other, and the types of data that they need to share back and forth. And DDEX has done a ton of work in standardizing how that data is shared, and sort of the way those packets are formatted so that constituents can share the data back and forth, like you said, as accurately as possible. And so, Andre asked, when can we expect to use open music infrastructure for digital rights management? And, where open music came in about 4 years ago, and I believe that you were both at some of those early meetings, and where we are now is how can we, within bigger entities, but also smaller entities, how can we make the transfer of that information as fluid and interoperable as possible? And it's a tricky system. And for any of those that were able to catch the radar conversation earlier today with George and Thomas and Megan and Aletta, Thomas from MIT Connection Science was talking some of this, which is that how can the information that can and should be public, for example, be out there in an accurate way? And then how can the information, so Michael, you spoke to catalogs being bought and sold. Obviously that information is proprietary. There's a lot of private information that Roundhill and that the artists and the artists' families, if the artists are deceased, are not trying to like broadcast to the world. And so how can we have sort of respect between those two different systems? And so, to answer your question, Andre, one of the things, and things have been a little bit stalled thanks to COVID, but one of the things that we're hoping to work on, both with Radar and in general with our membership, is to kickstart this back. We were supposed to meet in June in person. We probably won't be meeting in person anytime soon. I don't think anybody's trying to get in an airplane or be in a closed room with a bunch of people talking anytime soon. But I'm hoping that we'll have a digital meeting in the fall and start working within working groups on some of that, and allow startups and other companies that are interested in plugging in to start doing that. So time traveling a little bit, Michael and Deborah, what was it that first interested you about open music? If you can think back to those 4 years ago, I think that the industry was in a different place. It was pre-Mechanical Licensing Collective. It was pre MMA. Even some of the standards. What's that?
Pre-MMA.
Yeah, pre-MMA. And even some of the standards that now exist within DDEX were not as prevalent or hadn't been developed. And I think that has also changed some of the conversations. So what was the mindset and thoughts back then, if you can remember? And I'll go out on a limb and say that the meetings were not as congenial then as they are now.
That's an understatement.
So what were your thoughts when you first started coming to those meetings?
I didn't know what to expect. I mean, my background in the music business has been less on the technical side and more on the creative side, but I had to deal with, especially when I worked for a company called Muse, M-U-Z-E, and Muse was big in the data space. And I had to learn a lot. And I'm not a technical person at all, but the data became more and more critical, especially as digital distribution became the norm as opposed to just a sort of plaything. I never really felt like I fit in those meetings because I'm not a technical person, and a lot of the people there are really have a technical background, but I felt like it was important to understand. And because I had worked for this company, Muse, that was actually in the data business and distributed and sold metadata, that was our business, was building backends and then selling it to services. Digital music services didn't just have that data. They had to get it from somebody. It became more and more interesting to me as I started to realize that this was the machinery behind what drives these services that we all enjoy so much. And to be able to see the information about an artist, I mean, there's, the distinction that I make, I don't know if you make the same distinction, Michael, but, is there a formal metadata in terms of what the actual information is about the song and who's on it? And then there's the more contextual or informal metadata, which is the stuff that you don't see, that you get the liner notes from your old albums and you open up,
the coffee shop where they wrote the lyrics and who was there, and And
that stuff is still very important from a consumer standpoint, even though you can't pull the, album cover out and, sometimes, if you're buying vinyl, you can, but for the most part, the credits are so limited, and the record companies don't want to have multi-page inserts into their CDs anymore because they're too expensive. So there's like a fold out, and that's it. And you get basically the formal credits and not a lot of editorial and none of that stuff.
Or even the art.
That's right. It's become much more, now you have to go online to actually find this stuff. But I think that the data about the music, the musicians, even the instruments, what instrument was being played, what kind of guitar was being played, all of that stuff has become more important to consumers as they, try to enjoy music. And certainly when you're listening to it on a digital service and you don't have a physical booklet or something to open up, you never see this stuff. It's gone, basically.
No, you're so right. I mean, it's the texture of the experience, and it's an interesting point, Deborah, because while we've lost a lot of the physical artifacts, although I have been enjoying Bandcamp Fridays, and I've purchased more records in a small amount of time than I ever have, and it's like such a joy, like getting that physical artifact and like going through. That is one of the places where there's still, I think, even more so, artists are trying to put sort of more value and more like content, physical content into that. But you're so right that like we've lost for the most part the physical, experience of that listening. And yet at the same time, like we as consumers, thanks to like these digital spaces, have almost more expectations that something will be sort of multi-sensory and multi-dimensional. That like, when we're going to experience music, we expect, like whether you're, it's not me, but perhaps the teenagers out there, when they go into Fortnite and they experience something, they want it to be multidimensional. They want it to speak to the artist. They want like the skin or whatever that they purchase to be reflective of that artist. And so I think you're right. It's kind of a both and, in that like a lot of the information has been lost, and yet the ways that we're experiencing music, we need that information more than ever because there's now so many different ways that we can experience it.
When online music was first starting, and I worked for a number of the very first online distributors. I was the head of marketing for some early ones, and the word discovery became a very important concept in online music, because you could go and search for your favorite, Billy Joel album or whatever, but then the ability to have a list of artists that were like, if you like this, you might like that, but actually have it be relevant and not just kind of a bullshit list of artists, pardon my French. But you wanted to be able to recommendation engines online became a new thing. The idea that it got to know what you liked and that it would show you things that it thinks you liked, and it gets smarter as you start to pick and choose the ones that it shows you. All of those functionalities you take for granted now, but those didn't exist at the beginning. At the beginning, you had to think about what you wanted, you had to search for it, and you wouldn't necessarily see artists that influenced Billy Joel or artists whom Billy Joel influenced, and then be able to go click through and get deeper and deeper and deeper. That was, that took years to develop. That wasn't just an automatic thing that happened. And when you used to go into a record store, you could ask the record clerk, I'm into such an artist. Who do you think, discount records in Cambridge. That was my favorite record store when I went to school in Boston. You go into Discount Records, and G. Polland, who ran the store, knew every record in the store, and knew, you got advice from somebody who worked there. Now you're dependent on technology to be able to recommend things that it thinks you might like. That's a different experience.
Well,
please, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, Deborah, you took the word out of my mouth. The discovery is a big deal, and especially for the musician. I remember, again, when I was growing up, I wouldn't necessarily want to see who was influenced by whom. I wanted to see who that guitar player was and who that drummer was and who the producer was.
Yeah.
And then and I think that's and that's one of the big initiatives that a lot of these platforms are sort of doing, including of Spotify. But who would have known probably before the last 2 years, maybe, that all the guys from Toto were on the Thriller albums, and that's been a big thing, and that's come out in Luke Uther's book, and that's come out in a number of Sidemen documentaries, like Hitman.
I made Toto videos. I worked with Toto, and I made all their videos for Hold the Line and
awesome, awesome. But you know what I mean? It's that kind of thing where. Who did Mike? I'm guitar player by trade, but who did Mike Stern play with? Who did Schofield play with? Who did Larry Carlton play with? Who did what sessions did Jimmy Page play on? Or those are the kind of things for the musicians back in the day. Even now, like that's how people develop their tastes and the broadening of their style and finding their voice. So, especially from a musician level, and we're still missing that. You can get a little bit of that from all the stuff that's happening, the new platforms and YouTube and whatnot. But I think that's sort of like the next big boom that I know a couple of platforms are working on. And I'm really excited about that, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think that's such an important piece. And, last summer I had the pleasure of taking my children to Athens, Georgia, which most people would be like, why'd you go there? But it was because I'd never been. And we were, what's that?
The Indigo Girls.
Well, yeah, Indigo Girls, REM. And those are two, major bands for me. And so to be able to take them there, and again, it's all of these places that I've seen on the album covers for so long, and to take my children and make them drag their hot, tired, whiny little behinds to the various places. And, I think that we all, I'm not a musician by trade, but I'm certainly a music fan. And so those experiences and that information is so critical. And I think that there's still that desire, and yet how do we have the information? So, I'm curious from both of your perspectives, as we look forward, my hope ultimately with open music is that we build some of these protocols that allow companies to plug in, both large and small. Deborah, I actually want to touch on another point that you had mentioned, because I think this is so important. And I think it's actually really important when we talk about open music specifically. You had said, well, I'm not a technologist, and neither am I. And not only that, but I'm not a lawyer either. I don't know anything about music copyright other than what I've taught myself over the last few years. And I think that information asymmetry is such an important thing to kind of bring to the front. And one of the things that I hope that open music, has made an impact and will continue to make an impact. And so, I think that there's these two pieces of the work. One is, how can we have these protocols that connect large companies, small companies, emerging artists, et cetera, and allow them to put their information out there so that whether it's by voice, whether it's in VR, whether it's in AI, the information is there. It's easily accessed. It's easily built into the platform. And so no matter sort of which way you are discovering music, if my kids say, you know, play Iron Maiden, which is my son's favorite, you know, if he says that, might it eventually suggest other artists that are similar and allow him to perhaps enjoy new artists as well. And so I think that there's that aspect, but I think that there's also like this information asymmetry and an empowerment aspect. And I think one of the interesting things that I've noticed throughout open music is that, like you said, it's not only a tech platform sort of group of people. It's certainly technologists and folks that have worked in that space a lot, but it's also artists. It's also consultants such as yourself, people that have been more on the creative side. And I guess I'm curious, you know, from your perspectives, how has open music done that work? And sort of how has it balanced that, like, you know, working to bring the industry together and work on interoperability, but what type of work have you seen happen? And what is the work that's still to be done in that? How do we make the music industry as interoperable as, or rather as accessible as possible? And I think that we are just about there. I think we're just about out of time. But let's talk on that briefly.
Ask Eric. You go first.
Yeah, I think, you know, I view, you know, open music is more of like a, you know, like a consortium, like a place where people can discuss the different ideas and in an open forum, basically, whereby, you know, everybody has different ideas, different concerns, different criticisms, and different experiences with different platforms like, you know, blockchain and other types of things. You know, my personal feeling of what I got out of OMI, and I still, you know, I think the hopes are, is that, you know, it continues to do that. You know, putting out and making people aware of the open protocols and, you know, things like DDEX and other things that are coming around. I think that's the most value, because there's really not a body where people can come together and speak openly and freely about all of this and become aware, you know, whether there's new platforms that people are, you know, putting forth, or just new ideas or new concerns, or, okay, now with the MMA and the MLC, you know, this is what we don't like, or this is what we do like. And there's
how can we make it easy to plug in?
Right. But not even that, because I think once you have awareness, and once people have a better idea of what's out there, that is sort of secondary. That's sort of like the natural evolution. You know, everybody's going to have an API. Everything's going to be built to plug and play. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the same protocol, but if people are aware of the concerns and what's going on, you know, there's a better understanding that how they can make the connectivity, if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. Deborah, any last impressions for you? You know, has it been helpful or changed your comfort with technology and or sort of these more opaque parts of the industry?
You know, I'm as comfortable with technology as I need to be, kind of. So one thing I want to say is, you know, going back to my days from this company Muse, M-U-Z-E, and I have actually a giant book on my bookshelf called The Encyclopedia of Popular Music that Muse published, that was released in the UK, and a huge book with all kinds of information about hundreds and hundreds of artists. It shouldn't be that hard to find when you're listening to something, and now that it's pretty much all digital, I mean, it's hard to do this with CDs, to be able to dig deep to find out more about the music, the musicians, the side musicians, the primary. It shouldn't be that hard. This should be an easy thing for consumers to do who are music fans, to find out more about the artists that they really like. And I know that, you know, data is there's lots of data out there, but making it accessible to the average music fan is not yet really happening. You have to go search online to find something. I think the context for the music is more important. We don't sit and open up our albums and read the liner notes anymore like we used to on vinyl. Some people do, but for the most part, you're looking at a CD booklet. And I think that the context around the music is really important, and I don't think that there's enough of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. I think we are just about out of time, but I wanted to, again, thank you. And, I think that one of the things that's been most interesting for me has been the listening across the room, across all sides of that room. And I think that, Michael, you're so right in that, a lot of people go in there and hear from groups of people within the industry that they typically wouldn't, because we do sort of stay within our various corners. And so I'm looking forward to the next meeting, whether it's digital or eventually in person again, and seeing all of you. Thank you again, Berklee Valencia. There's information there in the chat, open-music.org. And thanks. Stay safe, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thanks.